I used to listen to this podcast that it was kind of like a game show at the end of the week, and they would, reference the news and whatever political events have happened, kind of like make fun of that. And I remember that the host would always open the podcast saying, "What a week!" And then he would go on to highlight whatever crazy thing had happened that week. And as I was preparing for the sermons for Holy Week and researching and thinking, I couldn't help but also reflect on the year that we've had. And, my first thought was, what a year. I have this memory when we just went into lockdown, over a year ago. We didn't know at that point how long it was going to last, right? We thought maybe, a week, maybe a couple of weeks, maybe a month. And I remember having conversations with the leadership of our church, considering whether we were going to be back in our building by Easter of last year. Little did we know that it would be almost a year before we would be able to resume in-person services in a completely different fashion, a completely different location than where we were before. So much has happened this past year. And for so many of us, not all of it has been good. Actually, a lot of it has been really bad and really difficult. I have this memory that the sermon that I preached for Good Friday last year, of reading that day, that Good Friday, was projected to be the day with the highest death toll of the pandemic up until that point. So I went back and looked at the numbers, and the death toll of that day was 2,263 deaths. And I remember really thinking that that was going to be the worst of it, right? And the things were gonna slowly get back normal, having no idea of what was ahead. So I was looking a little bit, and for example, I found a couple things. On Thursday, January 9th of this year, we crossed the threshold of 4,000 deaths in a day. As of the moment of this recording, we've had 128 million people worldwide infected with COVID and 2.79 million deaths. In the United States alone, we've had 30.4 million cases and 550,000 deaths. Here in Washington, D.C., we've had 44,248 cases and 1,059 deaths, not to mention the economic fallout that small business owners, people in the service industry, people usually in the most vulnerable sectors of society, and honestly, many, many more have suffered because of the lost jobs and the closing of the economy. Not to mention, the wave of, protests for racial justice that we saw in the summer due to the very public and awful murders of Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery and George Floyd and countless others who lost their lives to racial violence and white supremacy. I haven't even gotten to the part where there was a riot in the Capitol here in D.C. Or to the part where we've seen this increase of hateful rhetoric and violence against Asian Americans. Or the part that just a couple of weeks ago we had 2 mass shooting events in the space of 2 weeks. And I could go on and on and on. I'm sharing this with you to be morbid or dark, but just because we have to acknowledge that this has been a hard year. In a way, I think it felt like a year-long winter. And maybe the weather outside changes, but we're still most of the time locked inside. And the outlook of the world most of the time feels dark and grim, emotionally and psychologically. So we've been in a year-long winter. And I'm telling you all this because it's in moments like this ones that we've just gone through. Moments of profound pain and almost inexplicable suffering and grief, that we start looking for some sort of answer and explanation for what's happening. These are the moments that, if you are not sure if you believe in God or not, that you ask yourself, if there was a God, how could he possibly allow for something like this to happen? Maybe even if you're a Christian, you wonder that. Why is this happening? God, where are you? And today, we remember Good Friday, the day of the crucifixion of Jesus at the hands of the Roman Empire. And in this day of all days, those questions become incredibly poignant. Because I believe that the Good Friday story has something to say to us, something to say to our suffering, and something to say to our pain. Now for that, I want to take you to a passage that actually takes place before the crucifixion of Jesus. And this is the story of the resurrection of Lazarus. Now Lazarus is one of Jesus' close friends. And, from what we see in the Gospels, him and his two sisters, Mary and Martha, are really, really close with Jesus. And whenever Jesus is around the area where they live, he stays with them. And they have this wonderful close relationship. And one day, Lazarus gets really sick. And Lazarus' sisters know that Jesus is nearby, and they know that Jesus has, been going around Judea healing people. So they say, well, maybe Jesus can do something. And they send somebody to get Jesus and say, hey, the one whom you love, meaning Lazarus, is sick, and you come and do something for him. This story takes a weird turn because Jesus actually decides to wait for 2 days before going to see Lazarus. And what's in the story is that eventually Jesus gets to where Lazarus is. And by the moment that Jesus gets to where Lazarus is dead. And here's where we pick up our story. This is in Gospel of John, and I'm also reading on chapter 11, verse 17. It says, on his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Now, Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem. And many Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them in the loss of their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. Lord, Martha said to Jesus, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. If you scroll down a little bit in the story, Jesus has a similar encounter with Lazarus' other sister, Mary. And this is in verse 32. When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. When Jesus saw her weeping and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. Where have you laid him? He asked. Come and see, Lord, they replied. Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, see how he loved him. But some of them said, could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man had kept this man from dying? Where is God in our suffering? That's the age-old question. Some biblical scholars believe that the oldest book written in the Bible is not the book of Genesis, it's actually the book of Job. And if you're familiar with the book of Job is this kind of crazy story about this man that's righteous, that loves God, and who God has blessed tremendously. He's super wealthy, he has a beautiful wife, he has all these children, and he's a good guy, and he makes sacrifices before God and makes sure that he's not sinning and obeying God. And in the story, God and the devil have a conversation. The devil is trying to make a point that the only reason why Job is good and worships God is because of how blessed he is. So he's like, the second you stop blessing him, he will curse you to your face. So the story goes, Job loses everything. All his property, all of his wealth, all of his children die. His wife abandons him, and he gets all these sores over his skin that he's basically naked with a piece of clay scraping off because of the itch of the sores. And the whole book is basically these long chapters, are these speeches and poems wrestling with the idea of why suffering happens. Why do bad things happen to good people? The question that we all ask ourselves. And what's fascinating about the book is that God never answers the question. Even when God enters into the story and talks to Job, he never actually fully, truly answers the question of why suffering happens. And, throughout both the Old Testament and the New Testament, you're going to see all sorts of tragic and terrible and difficult events happening, and all sorts of reasons attributed as to why, from the evil and greed of people against one another to sometimes judgment from God, sometimes people reaping the consequences of their own actions. But the Bible never offers a unified theory of why suffering happens, why bad things happen. Now, certainly developed theories to explain suffering, and I think most of them are well-intentioned. We're trying to make sense of the crazy world that we live in, but at some point, all of our theories fall short. because they're not applicable to all events. One of my favorite writers is the biblical author N.T. Wright. He's a biblical scholar. And in the midst of the pandemic, he wrote an article for Times Magazine called "Christianity Offers No Answers About the Coronavirus. It's Not Supposed to." And the use of the article that he's making is that, it's counterintuitive to try to explain away the COVID crisis or any of the other bad things that have happened in the past year by just one thing. Is it because of sin and it's punishment from God? Well, we don't know that. Is God trying to do this in an increasingly secularized world to, confront us with the reality of our own mortality so like a religious revival could happen? Maybe, but we don't know that. Is this a result of our own, late capitalist practices run amok that have disturbed, nature and have affected global trade and have affected how we communicate? We don't know. And a lot of times what we're looking for in the moments of grief and difficulty is answers and explanations. And the crazy thing is that to the extent at which God has revealed himself to the world through the scriptures, he doesn't seem too interested in explaining the why of suffering. Which, when you believe in God, like I do, can be incredibly frustrating because we believe all these things about this God, right? We believe that he's good and merciful and compassionate and that he loves us. And yet, we look around us after a year like the one we just had, and it's almost impossible to reconcile that suffering with God. This is what's happening with Martha and Mary in the story that we just read, by the way. They have been close friends with Jesus, it would seem, for many years, and they believe that Jesus is the Messiah who has power to save. And yet, at their moment of most profound need, Jesus is nowhere to be found. And Jesus actually shows up late. So, of course, when Jesus shows up late, their first instinct is to recriminate him. Both Martha and Mary say the same words to Jesus. If you had been here, my brother would not have died. And again, Jesus never explains why he's late. Either to Mary or to Martha, why he didn't get there on time. And yet, at the same time, the story also doesn't let us believe that Jesus doesn't care about Lazarus or Mary or Martha. As a matter of fact, the writer tries to make that explicit, how much he cares for them. On that same chapter, in verse 33, it says, when Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. Where have you laid him? He asked. Come and see, Lord, they replied. Jesus wept. Jesus doesn't offer answers or explanations, but he's also not aloof. He offers something better than that. He offers his presence. He doesn't stop the pain, but he also doesn't abandon Mary and Martha to their grief. He joins them in it. I'm reading this book by James K. Smith, who's a philosophy professor at Calvin College, and the title of the book is On the Road with St. Augustine, and the gist of the book is that he looks at how St. Augustine, thought about different topics and applies Augustinian thought to our current times. And there's a chapter on justice and the nature of evil that I found really interesting, because when it comes down to it, Augustine doesn't think that God offers an answer that fully explains evil. However, Smith points out that Augustine does not think that God ignores evil and suffering. Instead, he addresses it. He does something about it by entering into human history through Christ. Smith says, this isn't an answer to evil. It is a response. And I'm telling you this because I don't have answers and explanations. I don't know why all of the things that have happened this past year happened. But what the story of Good Friday tells me, the story of Jesus being betrayed and put on trial and executed tells me is that Jesus knows what it's like to suffer. That Jesus, through the cross, joins in our suffering. That when Jesus sees Mary and the people who were with her weeping, what does he do? He joins in. He weeps with them. And I'm showing you this story because this is part of what's going on at a deeper, more cosmic level during Good Friday. The story of Good Friday is the story of God through Jesus joining in the weeping with all of humanity, in the suffering of us all. It's God sitting next to us in the midst of our pain and our loss and our grief. And even when He doesn't explain why it's happening, He makes sure to hold our hands all the way through it, even if it kills Him. I don't know why what has happened. I really don't. But I do know the answer to the question of where was God in the midst of all of this. He was weeping with us, suffering with us, dying for us. I've been candid about the fact that in the first year of, leading up to the launch of the church, I struggled with anxiety and with depression. And in the midst of that, I remember praying and asking God, why? Like, why was this happening to me? And I'll be honest, I never got an answer. But one of the things that helped me was that as I was reading the Bible through that time, I came across the prophecy about Jesus' suffering in the book of Isaiah. And I want to read a part of it to you today because this is perhaps a more vivid description of what Jesus went through than what you even find in the actual Passion narrative. So this is Isaiah chapter 53, and I'm just reading on verse 2. It says, He grew up before him like a tender shoot and like a root out of dry ground. He had no beauty or majesty to attract us to him. Nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering and familiar with pain. Like one from whom people hide their faces, he was despised and we held him in low esteem. Surely he took up our pain and bore our suffering. Yet we consider him punished by God, stricken by him, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. The line on verse 3 that says, a man of suffering and familiar with pain. The translation I usually read from reads, acquainted with sorrow. And something happened to me when I read that verse. Because, I knew this intellectually. Like I had this, of course, Jesus suffers for us. Like that's at the core part of the gospel, right? But I had this internal spiritual realization that Jesus wasn't unfamiliar with my pain. That I wasn't alone in my suffering, that Jesus was with me. And how was he with me? Well, on the cross. That some way and somehow that I cannot fully explain or understand, that one act, that event of Jesus willingly laying down his life, not only accomplishes forgiveness of sins and reconciliation with God, but it's also an act of divine solidarity, where God is joining each and every one of us in our pain and our suffering. The cross is God saying, I know what it's like, and I'll bear this pain with you. Reflecting on this dynamic of suffering, James Smith says, God doesn't give us an answer. He gives us himself. Now the story of Lazarus, or the story of Jesus for that matter, they don't end with death. However, perhaps this is an appropriate point to end the reflection today. That even though there aren't answers and explanations, there is Jesus weeping with us and dying for us. And perhaps the best thing we can do today is respond to the death of Jesus in the same way in which God has responded to our suffering, by joining in that weeping and joining in that lament. In the lament of hundreds of thousands in our country and the millions across the world who have lost somebody. In the lament of our Black neighbors and our Asian neighbors who have experienced the pain of racism and discrimination and violence this past year. In the lament of all of us who have experienced the effect of sin in our lives, whether it's our own sin or the sin of somebody else. You know, the night that Jesus gets arrested, the Gospel of John captures this exchange that Jesus has with his disciples in the Garden of Gethsemane before he's arrested. And he's about to go to pray, and this is famous, Jesus praying in the Garden of Gethsemane. But before he goes to pray, he asks his disciples this. On Matthew 26, he says, "Then he said to them, 'My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death.'" This is Jesus overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death for our sake, joining in our overwhelmedness with sorrow to the point of death that we're so familiar with. And Jesus invites us to join him in that. He says, "Stay here and keep watch with me." That invitation of Jesus is an invitation to solidarity, to join in how God is present with humanity in our pain. And I think that that's invitation for us today and tomorrow during Holy Saturday to stay here and keep watch with him. To join Jesus in his weeping for the world. So that in that, even if we don't get answers or explanations to suffering, we get comfort and the presence of God. And we're transformed by his love. Grace and peace.